The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of the small motel room as Robert Chen opened his eyes. For a moment, he forgot where he was. So different from the penthouse suite he usually woke up in with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. This room with its faded floral wallpaper and lumpy mattress cost $60 a night. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could buy the entire motel chain without making a dent in his fortune. Robert sat up and ran his fingers through his hair, longer now than it had been in years. His normally clean-shaven face sported a 2-week-old beard. The mirror across the room reflected back a stranger, exactly what he wanted. 3 weeks ago, Robert Chen, CEO of Horizon Innovations and worth over $4 billion, had vanished from his high-profile life. No tropical island getaway, no exclusive mountain retreat. Instead, he'd boarded a bus with nothing but a backpack containing some basic clothes, a few $100s in cash, and a worn leather journal. His executive team thought he was on a private meditation retreat, with no communication allowed. In reality, he was on a different kind of journey. Day 22, he murmured, jotting the date in his journal, still unrecognized. It had started with a comment from his teenage nephew at a family dinner. "Uncle Rob, do you even remember what normal life is like? When was the last time you rode a bus or stood in line for coffee?" The question had stuck with him for days. When had he last experienced ordinary life? Had success created an invisible barrier between him and the rest of the world? The thought troubled him deeply. So here he was, living on a strict budget, staying in budget accommodations, taking public transportation, and talking to people who had no idea they were speaking to one of the richest men in the country. People who weren't trying to impress him, sell him something, or get something from him. Robert pulled on a faded blue t-shirt he'd bought at a thrift store, paired with jeans that were starting to feel like a second skin. He slipped his feet into worn sneakers, a far cry from his collection of handmade Italian shoes. His disguise was complete not because it was elaborate, but because it was so thoroughly ordinary. He grabbed a quick breakfast at the diner next door where the waitress, Dottie, according to her name tag, now greeted him by name. "Morning, Rob." The usual. "Yes, please," he replied with a genuine smile. The usual, scrambled eggs, toast, and black coffee, cost $5.99. 3 weeks ago, he wouldn't have noticed spending 100 times that amount on breakfast. "Big plans today?" Dottie asked as she refilled his coffee cup. Robert shrugged. "Thought I might head downtown, maybe check out the main train station. I heard there's a piano there that anyone can play." "Oh, the station piano. My daughter loves watching videos of people playing that thing. Some real talents show up there sometimes." She leaned in conspiratorially. "Do you play?" A small smile crossed Robert's face. "A little." What Dottie didn't know, what nobody in his business world knew, was that Robert had once been on track to become a concert pianist. Music had been his first love, long before business and technology. His immigrant parents, while supportive of his talent, had gently pushed him toward a more practical career. Piano became his private passion, something he played alone in his home studio after long days of boardroom battles and business deals. After finishing his breakfast and leaving Dottie a tip that was generous but not suspicious, Robert caught a city bus heading downtown. He settled into a seat near the back, watching the city pass by through the window. Neighborhoods changing from block to block in ways you never noticed from a private car. An elderly woman boarded at one stop, struggling slightly with her shopping bag. Robert stood and offered his seat. The small nod of thanks she gave him somehow felt more genuine than the elaborate praise he received at charity galas, where he donated millions. The bus dropped him off 3 blocks from Central Station, and he walked the rest, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the anonymity of being just another person on a crowded sidewalk. No one making way for him, no one recognizing him, no one treating him differently. The station was busy, as he expected for a Tuesday mid-morning. The massive main concourse echoed with announcements, conversations, rolling suitcases, and hurried footsteps. Robert paused just inside the entrance, taking in the scene. Hundreds of lives intersecting briefly before continuing on different trajectories. And there, in the center of it all, stood a gleaming black grand piano. Robert watched as a young woman finished playing something upbeat and contemporary to scattered applause before hurrying off to catch her train. The piano sat empty now, almost calling to him. He hesitated. Playing in public hadn't been part of his plan when he started this journey. He'd been looking for authentic interactions, to remember what it felt like to be treated as an ordinary person. But perhaps this was part of it, doing something simply for the joy of it. Not as the billionaire Robert Chen, but as Rob, the guy staying at a budget motel who liked to play piano. Robert approached slowly, his heart beating faster than it did before major business presentations. A few people glanced his way, but most hurried past, focused on their own destinations. He set his backpack down and settled onto the bench, adjusting it slightly. His fingers hovered over the keys. What should he play? Something showy and technical to impress? No, that wasn't why he was here. He closed his eyes for a moment and let his hands find the keys naturally. He began with something simple, Debussy's Clair de Lune. The gentle opening notes were almost swallowed by the station's noise, but as he continued, as the familiar melody developed, he felt himself relaxing into the music. A lifetime ago, his piano teacher had told him he had a rare gift, not just technical skill, but the ability to communicate emotion through music. "You don't just play the notes, Robert. You tell a story with them," she had said. What story was he telling now? Perhaps one about loneliness in crowds, about searching for meaning beyond success, about the parts of ourselves we keep hidden. As the piece progressed, Robert became aware that the ambient noise around him had changed subtly. Fewer announcements seemed to be cutting through, fewer hurried footsteps passing by, or maybe he was just too absorbed in the music to notice them. When he finished Clair de Lune, he opened his eyes to find a small cluster of people had gathered around the piano. An unexpected wave of vulnerability washed over him. In the boardroom, he never doubted himself. Here, playing for strangers who knew nothing of his wealth or power, he felt strangely exposed. A young father holding a toddler caught his eye and nodded appreciatively. "That was beautiful, man. Do you know any Einaudi?" Robert smiled. "A little." He transitioned into Nu Vol Bianca, the notes flowing easily from memory. More people stopped. A businesswoman checked her watch but remained standing nearby, briefcase at her feet. Two teenagers put their phones down to listen. As he played, Robert realized something was happening that he hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades. He was connecting with strangers not because of who he was, but simply through music. No business agenda, no networking, no strategic relationships, just human connection in its purest form. And in that moment, as his fingers danced across the keys of a public piano in a busy train station, Robert Chen, the billionaire in disguise, felt something crack open inside him. A door long closed was starting to open again. He didn't know where this journey would lead, or what he would discover about himself or the world around him. But for now, in this moment, playing for an audience who had no idea who he really was, he felt more authentic than he had in years. The piece was building toward its emotional peak when Robert noticed an older man at the edge of the growing crowd. Something about his expression, a mixture of surprise and knowing, made Robert's fingers falter slightly. Did the man recognize him? Had his cover been blown? He recovered quickly, finishing the piece with the same careful emotion with which he'd begun. As the final notes hung in the air and a smattering of applause broke out, Robert made a decision. He would continue playing, continue this experiment in anonymity and connection. Whatever happened next would be part of the journey. His fingers found the keys again, and he began to play one of his own compositions, something he had written during a particularly difficult period, after his company went public. It was music no one had ever heard before, music that expressed things he had never put into words. And as he played, the crowd around the piano grew larger still, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. The sight of an ordinary-looking man playing extraordinary music, his soul open for all to see. Robert lost himself in the music, his original composition flowing through his fingers. He had written this piece during those sleepless nights after his company went public, when success brought not joy but a strange emptiness. The melody started simply, almost hesitantly, before building into something more complex and questioning. He became vaguely aware that the crowd had grown. Commuters who normally rushed through the station with eyes fixed on their phones or the clock now paused, drawn by the unexpected music filling the vast space. A little girl tugged her mother's hand, pulling her closer to the piano. An older gentleman set down his briefcase. A group of teenagers stopped their chatter. The station's usual cacophony, Announcements, rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps seemed to dim as more people gathered around. Robert kept his eyes mostly on the keys, occasionally glancing up to see the growing circle of faces. What struck him most was how diverse the crowd was, different ages, backgrounds, walks of life, all connected in this moment by music. A station security guard approached, and for a second Robert worried he might be asked to stop. Instead, the guard leaned against a nearby pillar, radio momentarily silent, and simply listened. As Robert's composition reached its conclusion, genuine applause erupted around him. Not the polite, obligatory applause of charity galas or business functions, but spontaneous appreciation from strangers who had no idea they were applauding one of the richest men in the country. "That was beautiful," said a woman in scrubs, clearly heading to or from a hospital shift. "Did you write that yourself?" Robert nodded, suddenly feeling shy in a way he never did in boardrooms. "Yes, a few years ago." "You should record it," said a young man with headphones around his neck. "I'd stream that," Robert smiled. If only they knew about the state-of-the-art recording studio in his penthouse that sat mostly unused. "Play another," called someone from the back of the crowd. Without overthinking it, Robert began to play again. This time he chose Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the first piece he had ever mastered as a young student. His fingers moved from memory, muscle and mind working together in perfect harmony. As he played, he remembered his childhood piano teacher, Mrs. Wilson, who had believed in his talent long before anyone believed in his business acumen. "Music will always be honest," she had told him. "In business and relationships, people can hide behind words, but in music, the truth always comes through." What truth was coming through now? Robert wondered as his fingers danced across the keys. Perhaps that beneath the tailored suits, the business decisions, the wealth and status, there was still the boy who had once dreamed of playing in concert halls. As he played, he noticed a man about his age sitting on a nearby bench. Unlike the others who watched with casual interest, this man was studying Robert with unusual intensity. Something about him seemed familiar, though Robert couldn't place him. Had they met in his other life? Was his cover about to be blown? Robert finished the piece and was met with more enthusiastic applause. Before anyone could request another song, he stood and gave a small, humble bow. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I need a break, but I'll play again another time." As he picked up his backpack, the man who had been watching him approached. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low. "Do I know you from somewhere?" Robert's heart rate kicked up. "I don't think so," he answered, keeping his voice casual. "I'm just passing through town." The man squinted slightly. "You remind me of someone." "A businessman I met once." "Chen? Robert Chen?" A chill ran through Robert. 22 days of anonymity and now this. He had two choices, deny it and walk away or admit the truth. "I get that a lot," Robert said with a small laugh. "Must have one of those faces." The man didn't seem entirely convinced but nodded anyway. "Well, you play beautifully. Almost professionally." "Thank you," Robert said, eager to change the subject. "Do you play?" "Used to." "Not much time these days." The man extended his hand. "I'm David, by the way." "David Wong." Robert shook his hand. "Rob," he replied, using only his first name, the shortened version no one in his business life ever used. "Well, Rob, there's a small cafe around the corner that a lot of musicians hang out at. If you're interested in meeting some local players, you should stop by. Place called Blue Notes. I'm heading there now." Robert hesitated. His plan had been to experience ordinary life, not to make connections that might complicate his temporary escape. But there was something about David that seemed genuine, and the idea of talking music instead of mergers appealed to him. "Sure," he said finally. "Lead the way." As they walked through the station, several people nodded or smiled at Robert, recognizing him from his performance. It felt strange, being acknowledged not for his wealth or power, but simply for sharing music. Blue Notes turned out to be a cozy cafe with jazz playing softly in the background. Album covers and signed photos of musicians decorated the walls. The smell of coffee and freshly baked goods filled the air. "Pete," David called to the barista. "This is Rob. He was just playing at the station. You should have heard him." The barista, an older man with salt and pepper dreadlocks, gave Robert a nod. "Station pianos seen all types. Good ones, bad ones, and everything in between. What's your poison, Rob?" "Just coffee black," Robert said, reaching for his wallet. "First one's on the house for station piano players," Pete said with a wink. House rule. Robert felt a strange warmth at this small gesture. When was the last time anyone had given him anything without expecting something in return? They settled at a small table in the corner. David, it turned out, was a music teacher at a local high school. As they talked, Robert was careful to keep details about himself vague, while still remaining truthful where he could. "So what do you do, Rob?" David asked eventually. "I'm in business," Robert replied simply, "taking some time off to figure out my next steps." "Ah, the midlife reassessment," David said with understanding. "I had mine 5 years ago. Almost quit teaching to join a cruise ship band." "What stopped you?" David smiled. "Realized I'd miss seeing that moment when a kid finally gets a piece they've been struggling with. Nothing beats that." He took a sip of his coffee. "So what are you figuring out?" Robert stared into his cup. How could he explain without revealing too much? "I guess whether success in one area means I need to give up passion in another." David nodded slowly. The classic dilemma. Though most people have the opposite problem, their passion doesn't pay the bills. "I'm fortunate that way," Robert admitted. They talked for over an hour, about music mostly, but also about life's unexpected turns. David spoke of his students, his divorce, his hopes to start a community music program. Robert shared carefully edited stories about his childhood, his piano teacher, his love of classical compositions. Not once did David mention Robert Chen again, and gradually, Robert relaxed. This was exactly what he had been seeking, genuine human connection based on shared interests rather than wealth or status. As they were finishing their coffee, David's phone chimed with a text. "Duty calls," he said, standing up. "Department meeting I can't miss. It was great talking with you, Rob." He hesitated, then pulled a business card from his wallet. "If you're still in town next week, we're having a small recital at the school. Nothing fancy, just students and a few teachers. You'd be welcome to attend, or even play a piece if you're up for it." Robert took the card, surprised by how touched he felt at the invitation. "Thank you. I'll think about it." After David left, Robert remained at the table, turning the business card over in his fingers. David Wong, music department head, Lincoln High School. A simple card, not the thick, embossed kind exchanged in corporate settings. "Refill?" Pete asked, stopping by his table. "No thanks," Robert replied. "But that was a great cup of coffee." Pete grinned. "Secret's in the roasting. You play regular at the station?" "First time today, actually." "Well, you've got a standing invitation here anytime you play. The arts need supporting, you know? Not enough people care these days." As Robert left the cafe, he felt a weight in his chest, not unpleasant but profound. In his real life, he donated millions to arts organizations, sat on the boards of prestigious music schools, funded scholarships. But here was Pete offering free coffee to musicians. Different scales, same value. Walking back toward his motel, Robert found himself thinking about David's invitation and about the faces in the crowd at the station. For the first time in years, he'd connected with people through music, not money. He'd been seen, truly seen. Not as Robert Chen, billionaire CEO, but simply as a man who could play piano. Tomorrow, he decided, he would go back to the station. He would play again, and maybe, just maybe, he'd attend that school recital next week. His journey into ordinary life was taking an unexpected turn, and he was curious to see where it might lead. That night, in his modest motel room, Robert opened his laptop, the one non-luxury item he'd brought with him, and began composing a new piece inspired by the day's events. As his fingers moved across the keyboard, he felt more alive than he had in years. Over the next few days, Robert fell into a new routine. Each morning, he'd have breakfast at Dottie's Diner, then make his way to the station to play the piano for an hour or two. Afterward, he'd stop by Blue Note's cafe, where Pete would have his coffee ready and waiting. Word began to spread about the mysterious piano player at the station. More people gathered to listen each day. Some were regulars who adjusted their commutes to catch his performances. Others were newcomers drawn by word of mouth or short video, clips that had started appearing online. Robert remained oblivious to his growing local fame until the 5th day when a college student approached him after he finished playing. "Chopin, excuse me," she said, holding up her phone. "Are you the guy from the video? The station pianist?" Robert blinked in surprise. "What video?" She turned her phone screen toward him. There he was, playing the piano, completely lost in the music. The video had over 50,000 views. Someone posted this 3 days ago, she explained. It's been shared like crazy. People are calling you the commuter virtuoso. Robert felt a flutter of panic. He hadn't considered the possibility of social media exposure. What if someone from his company saw the video? What if his cover was blown? I didn't realize anyone was recording, he said quietly. Oh, there are tons of videos now, the student said cheerfully, seemingly unaware of his discomfort. You're kind of becoming internet famous. In a good way, she added quickly. People love your playing. It's so real, you know. Real. The word echoed in Robert's mind as he thanked her and headed to Blue Notes in a daze. Wasn't that what he had been seeking? Authentic connections, real experiences, genuine reactions to who he was rather than what he owned. Pete noticed his troubled expression the moment he walked in. You look like you need something stronger than coffee, he commented, sliding Robert's usual cup across the counter. I just found out people have been posting videos of me playing, Robert said, dropping onto his usual stool at the counter. Pete laughed. Well, yeah. Did you think no one would notice a guy playing like that at a public piano? Welcome to the digital age, my friend. I'm not looking for attention, Robert said. Nobody interesting ever is, Pete replied with a knowing smile. That's the irony. Those who crave the spotlight rarely deserve it, while those who shy away from it often have something worth sharing. Robert sipped his coffee thoughtfully. I guess I just wanted to connect with people on a basic human level. No expectations, no agendas. And now you're doing that with thousands instead of dozens, Pete pointed out. Is that so bad? Before Robert could answer, the cafe door opened and David walked in with an older woman. Rob, I was hoping to find you here, David said, his face lighting up. This is Mrs. Thompson, the principal at Lincoln High. The woman extended her hand with a warm smile. David tells me you're quite the pianist. Robert shook her hand, feeling oddly nervous. He's too kind. Not at all, David said. Look, I know this is last minute, but we have a situation. The professional pianist we hired for our fundraiser tonight had to cancel. Family emergency. Any chance you could fill in? Robert froze. A school fundraiser meant a bigger audience, more exposure, greater risk of being recognized. I don't know, David, I'm not really… Please, Mrs. Thompson cut in gently. It's for our music program. Budget cuts have hit us hard, and tonight's event is crucial for funding next year's classes. Robert thought of his own childhood, how music education had shaped him before business took over his life. He thought of the billions in his bank accounts and how easy it would be to just write a check instead. But that would be Robert Chen, the CEO, not Rob, the station pianist. What would I need to play? He asked finally. David looked relieved. Nothing too challenging for someone of your talent. A few classical pieces during dinner, maybe something more contemporary later. The event starts at 7 at the Grand Hotel Ballroom. The Grand Hotel. Robert's heart sank. He had attended countless business functions there. The risk of being recognized just increased significantly. Still, he heard himself saying, I'll do it. Mrs. Thompson beamed. Wonderful. We can't pay much, I'm afraid. No payment necessary, Robert said quickly. Consider it my contribution to music education. After they left, Pete leaned across the counter. The Grand Hotel, huh? Fancy gig for a guy trying to stay under the radar. Robert looked up sharply. What do you mean? Pete gave him a long, measured look. I've been serving coffee to all types for 30 years. I notice things, like how your worn jeans are actually designer, how your casual watch probably costs more than my yearly rent, how you sometimes slip and use words that don't match your backstory. Robert felt his chest tighten. I'm not… Save it, Pete said, not unkindly. Your secrets are safe with me. We all have our reasons for the roles we play. He refilled Robert's cup. This one's on the house, too. Consider it my contribution to whatever journey you're on. That afternoon, Robert returned to his motel room and stared at his limited wardrobe options. Nothing appropriate for playing at a fundraiser at the Grand Hotel. With a sigh, he realized he would need to make a purchase. At a department store, he found a simple black suit that fit reasonably well off the rack. It wasn't tailored like his usual attire, but it would do. As he paid, he noticed the cashier looking at him curiously. Has anyone ever told you that you look like that tech billionaire? The one who makes the smart home systems? Robert forced a laugh. I wish I had his money. The cashier smiled. Don't we all? By 6:30 that evening, Robert was walking into the service entrance of the Grand Hotel. as David had instructed. The ballroom was decorated elegantly but not lavishly, clearly a school working with limited resources. A beautiful grand piano sat on a small stage at one end of the room. Robert ran his fingers lightly over the keys, relieved to find it recently tuned. "It's not a Steinway, but it'll do," David said, appearing beside him. "It's perfect," Robert assured him. As 7 o'clock approached, guests began arriving, teachers, parents, local business owners, all dressed in their finest to support the school's music program. Robert stayed near the piano, keeping his head down as he arranged his sheet music, though he knew he wouldn't need it. From his position, he scanned the growing crowd, looking for any familiar faces from his business life. He spotted a few local politicians, the owner of a car dealership he'd seen in commercials, but no one who would recognize Robert Chen. Just as he began to relax, his blood ran cold. Walking through the entrance was Thomas Whitfield, one of his company's major investors. Robert quickly turned away, adjusting the piano bench, his heart pounding. What were the chances? The lights dimmed slightly and Mrs. Thompson approached the microphone to welcome everyone. As she began introducing the evening's program, Robert considered his options. He could make an excuse and leave. He could play with his back mostly to the audience, keeping his head down, or he could simply play with the same honesty and emotion he'd found at the station piano, and accept whatever came. Mrs. Thompson was thanking the sponsors and supporters of the event. And now, to provide our musical accompaniment for the evening, we are fortunate to have with us a gifted pianist who has recently been delighting commuters at Central Station. Please welcome Rob. Just Rob. No last name, no title, no credentials. Just a man who played piano. As the polite applause washed over him, Robert took a deep breath and began to play. He started with Debussy, then moved to Chopin, letting the music flow through him, creating a gentle backdrop for the mingling guests. He kept his gaze mostly on the keys, but occasionally glanced up to see people listening, smiling, nodding in appreciation as they sipped their drinks and engaged in conversation. An hour into the event, during a brief break, a server brought him a glass of water. "The gentleman at table 7 sent this," she said. "He also asked if you take requests. Table 7. Robert's eyes flicked in that direction. Thomas Whitfield was watching him with an unreadable expression. The server waited expectantly. "Should I tell him you do?" Robert hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, what's his request?" She returned moments later. "He'd like to hear Rhapsody in Blue, if you know it." Robert almost laughed. He and Thomas had once discussed Gershwin at a company dinner. Thomas had mentioned it was his favorite piece, and Robert had agreed it was a masterwork of American music. As Robert began to play the complex, jazz-influenced classical piece without sheet music, he saw Thomas's eyebrows raise in surprise. The conversation in the room gradually died down as more people turned to watch him play. The piece was challenging, blending classical structure with jazz rhythms, requiring both technical precision and emotional expression. Robert lost himself in it, pouring everything into the performance, his journey of the past weeks. The connections he'd made, the simple joys he'd rediscovered, when he hit the famous clarinet glissando, playing it as a piano run with perfect execution. He looked up briefly and locked eyes with Thomas Whitfield. In that moment, Robert saw recognition dawn on the investor's face, but he didn't stop playing. He couldn't stop now. Not in the middle of something so important. So he continued, his fingers dancing across the keys, building toward the piece's triumphant conclusion. When the final notes faded, the room erupted in applause, not polite, obligatory applause, but genuine, enthusiastic appreciation. People stood, clapping and cheering. Robert stood and gave a small, humble bow. As the applause continued, he looked again at table 7. Thomas Whitfield was on his feet, applauding with the rest, a complex mix of emotions on his face. Whatever happened next, Robert realized, there was no going back. His two worlds were about to collide, and he wasn't entirely sure he was ready. After his performance, Robert was surrounded by appreciative guests offering compliments and thanks. He smiled and nodded, all the while keeping one eye on Thomas Whitfield, who remained at his table watching. Mrs. Thompson approached with tears in her eyes. "That was beyond anything we could have hoped for," she said, clasping his hands. "You've made this evening truly special." David appeared at her side, beaming. The donation pledges are pouring in. We've already doubled our goal. Robert felt a strange mix of pride and anxiety. He was genuinely happy to have helped, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed world was about to change. I should go, he said quietly to David. I'm not really comfortable with all this attention. David looked disappointed but nodded. I understand. Let me at least walk you out. As they made their way toward the service exit, a familiar voice called out, Excuse me. Robert turned to find Thomas Whitfield standing there, looking both puzzled and amused. Thomas, Robert said before he could stop himself. Thomas's eyebrows rose. So it is you. I thought I was seeing things. He looked Robert up and down, taking in the off-the-rack suit and the longer hair. What exactly is going on here, Robert? David looked back and forth between them. You two know each other? Thomas extended his hand to David. Thomas Whitfield. I'm an investor in Mr. Chen's company. He turned back to Robert. A company, I might add, whose CEO has supposedly been on a private meditation retreat for the past few weeks. Robert felt a flash of irritation. This was exactly what he'd been trying to escape. People who saw him only as a CEO, an investment, a business connection. David, he said, could you give us a minute? Once they were alone, Thomas crossed his arms. So, are you going to explain why one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in the country is moonlighting as a pianist at a high school fundraiser? Robert sighed. It's not what you think. I doubt I could even imagine what's actually happening here, Thomas replied dryly. Robert glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. I needed some time away. Time to remember what it feels like to be treated like a normal person, to connect with people who don't want anything from me. Thomas's expression softened slightly. And have you found what you were looking for? Before Robert could answer, his phone buzzed in his pocket, the basic prepaid phone he'd purchased for this journey, not his usual high-tech device. The text was from David, people asking for an encore. One more song possible? Robert looked up at Thomas. I need to play one more song. Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Then play. We'll talk after. As Robert made his way back to the piano, whispers followed him. He could feel the shift in the room's energy. Something had changed, though most people couldn't name what it was. He sat at the bench and closed his eyes, considering what to play. After a moment, his hands found the keys, and he began the piece he'd been composing in his motel room over the past few days. A new composition, never performed before. The music started softly, tentatively, like someone testing unfamiliar waters. Then it grew, building layers of complexity and emotion. It was the story of his journey, the isolation of success, the hunger for genuine connection, the rediscovery of an old passion. As he played, Robert opened his eyes and looked out at the audience. They were completely silent, captivated. Even the servers had stopped to listen. In the back, he spotted Thomas watching with an unreadable expression. Near the door stood Pete from the cafe, arms crossed, a knowing smile on his face. Robert had no idea how Pete had gotten in, but he wasn't surprised to see him there, and in the front, David and Mrs. Thompson stood side by side, their faces reflecting wonder and gratitude. This, Robert realized, was what he had been missing. Not the applause or admiration, but the pure, honest connection that came from sharing something real, something that came from his heart, not his bank account. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of complete silence before the room erupted in applause. Robert stood, bowed deeply, and without taking any further questions, made his way quickly to the exit. Outside in the cool night air, he took a deep breath. He wasn't surprised when the door opened behind him and Thomas stepped out. That was remarkable, Thomas said quietly. I had no idea you could play like that. There's a lot people don't know about me, Robert replied. Clearly. Thomas leaned against the wall. So what happens now? You've been discovered. The mysterious station pianist revealed as billionaire CEO. It'll make quite the headline. Robert frowned. Is that a threat? Thomas looked genuinely surprised. Of course not. I'm just stating facts. You must have known this masquerade couldn't last forever. They were interrupted by David pushing through the door. Rob or Robert, I guess. He looked confused and a little hurt. Mrs. Thompson just told me who you really are. Robert winced. David, I can explain. You're Robert Chen. The Robert Chen. The guy who invented the smart home system that's in like half the houses in America. David shook his head in disbelief. Why would someone like you pretend to be, well, ordinary? The question hung in the air between them. Thomas watched curiously, waiting for Robert's answer. Because I needed to remember what ordinary felt like, Robert said finally. When was the last time someone looked at me and just saw a person, not a walking bank account or a business opportunity? David's expression shifted from confusion to understanding. That's why you never mentioned your last name. Would you have treated me the same if you'd known? Robert asked. David thought for a moment, then shrugged. Honestly? Probably not. I'd have been intimidated, maybe tried to impress you. Exactly, Robert sighed. These past weeks have been the most real weeks of my life in years. Playing at the station, talking music with you, having coffee at Pete's place. No expectations, no agendas. Thomas had been listening quietly. Now he spoke up. The board has been asking questions, Robert. Your executive team can only cover for so long. I know, Robert admitted. My plan was always to go back. I just needed this time to figure some things out. And did you? David asked. Figure things out? Robert smiled. I think I'm starting to. The door opened again and Pete emerged, looking completely unfazed to be joining a conversation between a music teacher, a major investor, and a billionaire CEO. Quite a performance in there, Pete said, nodding to Robert. Worth sneaking in for. How did you get in? David asked. Pete winked. I know the caterer. Used to play in a band with him. He turned to Robert. So the cat's out of the bag, huh? Seems that way, Robert agreed. Pete nodded thoughtfully. What are you going to do now, Mr. Billionaire? The question hung in the air. What would he do now? Go back to his old life as if nothing had happened? Try somehow to maintain his anonymity despite being recognized? Neither option felt right. I don't know yet, Robert admitted. But I'm not ready to give up playing at the station. Thomas frowned. Robert, be reasonable. Once word gets out, who says it has to get out? Robert interrupted. He looked at each of them in turn. Does anyone here actually need to share this information? David immediately shook his head. Not me. Your secret's safe. Wasn't mine to tell in the first place, Pete added with a shrug. All eyes turned to Thomas, who looked uncomfortable. Robert, the company is fine, Robert insisted. My team knows how to reach me if there's a genuine emergency. I've only been gone 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which our stock has dropped 12 points, Thomas pointed out. Robert raised an eyebrow. And how many times has it dropped 12 points while I was sitting in my office? The market fluctuates, Thomas. You know that. Thomas didn't look convinced. The board won't be happy. I own 60% of the company, Robert reminded him. The board serves at my pleasure, not the other way around. For a moment, the old Robert Chen, confident, authoritative, used to getting his way, had surfaced. David and Pete exchanged glances. Noticing their reaction, Robert softened his tone. All I'm asking for is a little more time. Another week, maybe 2, to finish what I started here. Thomas sighed heavily. And what exactly did you start? Robert gestured toward the ballroom. Connecting with people. Making music. Remembering who I was before I became Robert Chen, CEO. He paused. And figuring out how to bring that person back into my life permanently. A thoughtful silence fell over the group. Finally, Thomas nodded slowly. 2 weeks. But you'll need to check in with the office. A simple email or call just so they know you're alive. Fair enough, Robert agreed. As Thomas walked away toward the parking lot, David turned to Robert. So, what happens tomorrow? Do you keep playing at the station? Robert smiled. That's the plan. Unless I'm not welcome anymore? Are you kidding? After tonight, you'd be welcome to play in the middle of Main Street if you wanted to, David laughed. Though I do have one condition. What's that? You have to tell me honestly if my students' recital pieces sound terrible, David said with a grin. No more being nice just to spare feelings. Deal, Robert laughed. As David headed back inside, Pete clapped a hand on Robert's shoulder. The coffee's still on the house, you know. Billionaire or not. I appreciate that, Robert said sincerely. Walking back to his motel under the stars, Robert felt strangely lighter, despite being partially discovered. There was something freeing about being known, at least by a few people, and accepted anyway. Tomorrow he would play at the station again. People would gather and listen, just as they had before. Some might recognize him eventually, but perhaps that was okay. Perhaps the worlds he had tried so hard to keep separate could coexist after all. For tonight, though, he was still just Rob, the station pianist, walking home after a successful performance, filled with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, Robert woke up with a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. His secret was out, at least to a few people, yet somehow, he felt more himself than he had in years. After breakfast at Dottie's diner, where he still managed to remain anonymous, he made his way to the station. The familiar sounds of announcements, rolling suitcases, and hurried footsteps greeted him as he entered the main concourse. The piano sat in its usual spot, currently unoccupied. Robert approached it slowly, aware that today felt different. Would playing feel the same now that he wasn't completely anonymous? Would the connection with strangers still feel genuine? Only one way to find out. He sat down at the bench and began to play. Bach this time, a piece that required focus and precision. As always, the music soon transported him, and the station around him faded into the background. Gradually, he became aware of people stopping to listen. The crowd seemed larger than usual. Had word spread? Did more people know who he was? Robert glanced up briefly and caught sight of a familiar face. Pete from the cafe leaning against a column, coffee cup in hand. He gave Robert a small nod of encouragement. When he finished the Bach piece, the applause was enthusiastic. An elderly woman approached the piano, her eyes bright with appreciation. "That was beautiful, young man," she said. "I come through this station every Tuesday, and hearing you play has become the highlight of my week." Robert thanked her, touched by the simple honesty of her comment. This was why he had started playing here, for these genuine human connections. As the morning continued, he played piece after piece, some classical, some contemporary, some his own compositions. People came and went. Some stayed for just a minute or two. Others lingered longer. A few dropped small bills into the empty coffee cup someone had placed on top of the piano, though Robert had never asked for money. Around noon, David appeared, carrying a small paper bag. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, handing the bag to Robert during a break between songs. "Pete sent a sandwich and coffee." "Thanks," Robert said, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness. "How's the aftermath of the fundraiser?" David grinned. "We raised enough to fund the music program for 2 years, not just one. Mrs. Thompson is over the moon." He hesitated, then added, "No one else knows about you, by the way." "We kept our word." Relief washed over Robert. "I appreciate that. Though I do have a message from Thomas," David continued. "He said to tell you that the board is calling an emergency meeting tomorrow. Something about a potential hostile takeover attempt. He said you'd understand." Robert's stomach tightened. The business world never stopped, never slowed down. A hostile takeover was serious, the kind of threat that required his full attention as CEO. "I see," he said quietly. David studied his face. "You're going to have to go back, aren't you?" Robert nodded slowly. "Sooner than I planned, it seems." "Well, you've got today," David pointed out. "Make it count." As David walked away, Robert contemplated what making it count might mean. If today was to be his last day as the anonymous station pianist, how should he spend it? He started playing again, pouring more emotion than ever into the music. People continued to gather, the crowd growing larger as the afternoon wore on. Around 3 o'clock, a young woman with a professional camera approached. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm from the City Tribune. We've been getting calls about the station pianist who's been moving people to tears. Would you mind if I took some photos and asked a few questions for a story?" Robert hesitated. A newspaper article would certainly expose his identity, yet there was something fitting about ending his anonymous journey with a gesture of openness. "Actually," he said, "I do have a story to tell. But not the one you're expecting." For the next half hour, Robert told the reporter about his experiment in anonymity, about rediscovering his passion for music, about the connections he'd made with ordinary people who had no idea who he really was. He asked her to withhold his last name and company details until the following week, after he'd had a chance to address the situation with his board. "So you're saying you're actually a successful businessman who's been playing piano in disguise?" The reporter asked, looking both skeptical and intrigued. "Yes," Robert admitted, "though I've discovered that the disguise might have been the most honest version of myself I've shown the world in years." As the reporter left with promises to respect his timeline, Robert returned to the piano. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the station's high windows. The evening commuters were starting to fill the concourse, many pausing when they heard the music. Robert began to play what he knew would be his final piece in the station, at least as an anonymous pianist. He chose the composition he'd been working on throughout his journey, now complete. It told the story of his past weeks, the initial uncertainty, the freedom of anonymity, the joy of connection, and now, the bittersweet return to responsibility. As he played, he noticed more people than ever gathering around the piano. The crowd had grown so large that station security had to create space for commuters to pass through. Phones were raised, recording the performance. Robert knew that by tomorrow his cover would likely be completely blown. Strangely, he felt at peace with that. In the middle of the piece, he looked up and was startled to see Thomas Whitfield standing at the edge of the crowd, watching intently. Beside him stood a woman Robert recognized as his chief operating officer, looking completely bewildered to find her boss playing piano in a train station. Robert nodded to them but didn't stop playing. This moment, this connection with the music and the crowd was too important to interrupt. As the piece reached its emotional peak, Robert noticed something extraordinary happening. People were wiping tears from their eyes. Complete strangers were exchanging glances of shared emotion. An elderly man had his arm around his wife's shoulders. A young mother held her child close. In that moment, Robert understood something profound. Music had allowed him to touch people's hearts in a way that all his technological innovations never had. His company had made people's lives more convenient, but his music had made them feel something. The final notes of his composition hung in the air, and for a moment, there was complete silence in the busy station. Then applause erupted, not just polite clapping, but cheers and whistles. People were standing, smiling through tears, expressing their appreciation not for a celebrity or a CEO, but for a man who had shared something beautiful. Robert stood and took a humble bow. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for listening." As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas and the COO approached the piano. "Robert," the COO said, her voice a mix of confusion and respect, "what on earth is going on?" Robert smiled. "A necessary detour, Lisa. One that's given me some clarity." Thomas looked at him curiously. "About what?" "About what comes next." Robert ran his fingers lightly over the piano keys one last time. "We should talk about the board meeting tomorrow, and about some changes I want to make." Later that night, back in his motel room for the last time, Robert made 2 phone calls. The first was to his executive assistant, asking her to prepare his office and schedule meetings with each department head for later in the week. The second call was to a real estate agent, inquiring about commercial property available near the train station. 3 months later, the old cafe next to the station reopened under new ownership. Blue Notes Music Cafe featured live piano performances throughout the day, with profits funding music education in public schools. A state-of-the-art recording studio occupied the upper floor, available free of charge to promising young musicians. The owner, while rarely present, sometimes stopped by on Tuesday mornings to play the piano himself. Most customers didn't recognize Robert Chen in his casual clothes, sitting at the piano with a coffee from Pete, now the manager, beside him. But it didn't matter if they recognized him or not. What mattered was the music, the connections, the moments of shared humanity in a busy world. And across the street, from his new corner office with a view of the station entrance, Robert ran his technology empire differently now. He still attended board meetings and made strategic decisions. But every day at noon, he stepped away from spreadsheets and projections to spend an hour at the piano. His executive team had been skeptical at first, but the results spoke for themselves. The company was more innovative, more human-centered, more successful than ever. As Robert had discovered during his weeks of anonymity, sometimes the best way to solve complex problems was to step away and let the music flow. The station piano that had started it all remained in place, available to anyone who wanted to play. A small plaque had been added reading simply, "Music connects us all. Take a moment to listen," and people did.